I think we're going to go ahead and get started. Stand up to the mic here. Thank you all for coming. This session is putting the public back in public airwaves, wireless policy in the broadband era. There's a lot of stuff happening with wireless policy, particularly inside Washington, D.C. A lot of politics, a lot of policy, and a lot of really interesting technology changes as well, shaping and influencing all of that. So we have a lot that we would like to talk about today, but we're going to start with some initial presentations by our distinguished panelists, and then we're going to leave about half the time in this session for Q&A. I'll get the ball rolling on a couple of big-level questions to let them chip in some different thoughts, and then we'll pass around a microphone for you to ask your questions. So I won't give too much in the way of an opening commentary because that's what their initial presentations are for, but spectrum is a big deal. It's billions of dollars in public resources that gets passed around and used for different commercial and public and educational purposes, and how that spectrum gets allocated makes a big deal of difference. And even once the spectrum is given out, lots of public policy and political steps are involved to make sure that the businesses that get built using that spectrum serve the public's interest. And the range and the scope and the history of all of these things is, I think, unknown to a lot of people and should be known to more. So thank you for coming and learning a little bit more. Our first presentation will be from Parul Desai from Policy Counsel from Consumers Union. I'm getting my titles mixed up. Parul's going to talk a little bit about why you should all care about wireless policy.
Thanks, Chris. I probably have the easiest job up here because I think for most people in this room it's pretty evident why we should care about wireless policy. I'm sure almost everyone in this room has accessed the internet through their smartphone or through their laptop through a wireless connection. So I think we all understand the importance of the internet and hopefully why we need to have more wireless access to the internet. While everyone in this room has access, or almost everyone in this room, I'm sure, 1/3 of the households in our country do not have access to the internet. And I think that's why the president has spoken about wireless access and why wireless access is so important, because getting wireless access or putting up wireless access is or could be a lot cheaper than wireline access. And so a lot of emphasis and a lot of emphasis has been put on wireless access to the internet. So this slide just gives you some data as to how folks are using wireless access. Many people are using it for jobs, communication, healthcare, innovation, just simple communication with family, friends. You'll also see that wireless access has become especially critical for communities of color. As the slide shows, the majority of communities of color are accessing the internet through wireless means, through their phones, through laptops, and they're using it for a variety of reasons. And so wireless access has become especially important, A, because we're seeing a lot of households are being left behind, but also because a lot of communities of color are relying on wireless access to get to the internet. And so some of what we've been doing in DC, my organization, Consumers Union, and a lot of the organizations on the panel have been trying to figure out how can we make sure that the wireless experience for many users is a seamless experience and that we're not subject to some anti-consumer practices or anti-competitive practices. And so some of the issues that we have been working on include bill shock, which some of you may have heard of. It's basically related to ensuring that when you get your cell phone bill, you're not surprised by overcharges. A lot of times we go over our data limits because we access the internet and we don't understand or know when we're actually going over those data limits. And so the FCC has asked, should we require our wireless carriers to notify us when we're about to go over our limits? So A, we know that we're going over our limits, and how much will it cost if we go over our limits? And so that's one issue that's being debated in DC right now and our organizations are working on. Another issue that we are looking at for consumers is truth in billing, and this relates to issues like, what speed are you getting, what's the cost of your connection, and so that's another issue that we are working on. and that's another issue that's pending at the FCC. A couple of other issues that we are working on that we have discussed is early termination fees. I know a lot of folks in this room are subject to early termination fees if they want to switch carriers before their 2-year or 1-year commitment. And so we have asked in various different contexts to both the FCC and the Hill to look at the issue of early termination fees and whether or not they're fair. Are they actually connected to the subsidy of the phone? And there's a lot of other different issues that we can talk about later with respect to early termination fees. But that's another area that we are looking to get some traction on and hopefully get some movement on. Another issue that we have been working on is the issue of what we call handset exclusivity. And this is basically, you all know what happened with the iPhone. The iPhone was only available initially on AT&T's service, which we thought was not a fair practice. We think handsets should be available to any carrier, so you don't have to rely on AT&T if you want to use your iPhone on Verizon, T-Mobile, Sprint, whatever the case may be. And so this issue basically relates to you having the ability to buy the handset of your choice and then pick the carrier of your choice. And so that's another issue that we are hoping to work on and get some progress on. Another issue that we have worked on is the issue of network neutrality. I think most people in this room have heard about network neutrality, and this is basically the ability of any user or consumer to be able to access the website of their choice, the application of their choice, attach whatever device of their choice to the network. The FCC recently did adopt some net neutrality rules. However, the rules that apply to wireless access are a little bit more limited, and so there are less protections on wireless services with respect to the issue of net neutrality. There are more protections when it comes to accessing the internet with respect to your wireline service, but with respect to wireless, the FCC adopted limited rules, and so we're hoping in the future we can try to push them a little bit further on this. Just for your information, the FCC also recently had a settlement with Verizon with respect to overage charges that a lot of folks were seeing, and this was basically consumers who had their Verizon service were accidentally accessing the internet or inadvertently accessing the internet and were being charged $2-3 a month, which obviously adds up. Verizon had initially denied that this was happening, and after investigation, the FCC found that consumers were being charged for inadvertent access to the internet. And so there was a settlement late last year in October where consumers are supposed to be getting refunds, and there's also going to be a deposit into the Treasury. And then finally, I'll mention, I think everyone in this room has heard that AT&T is looking to acquire T-Mobile, and so I think a lot of these issues will be coming up during the conversation around AT&T and T-Mobile. One committee on Capitol Hill has already announced that they're going to be having a hearing on this, so a lot of these issues with respect to spectrum policy that our panel will talk about, but also some of the more consumer-related issues like bill shock, truth in billing, handset exclusivity, early termination fees, I expect will be discussed in this context. So while we've been talking about these issues for a lot of years now, I think you'll start to hear more about these issues as we think more about the merits of AT&T purchasing T-Mobile. So that's all I have for now. I'll take questions later, but these are some of the issues that we're looking at currently.
Thanks, Parul. So, as Parul said, there's clearly a lot going on. There are a lot of active issues right now, and they have a tremendous impact on consumers and users. Wireless makes a huge difference in accessing the internet and in allowing all of us to be part of the media landscape. I mean, I think there's no question that the internet is the most important communications medium, at least in the growth sense. I don't want to denigrate the value of other communications media, but right now the one that I think is growing the fastest and is gaining the most in its importance is the internet, and wireless is such an important tool to access the internet, as Parul said. So we'll talk more later about the specifics of these issues in the Q&A. We'll really get into the weeds, but before we get to that, we're going to have a couple more presentations to sort of provide some background wireless is a pretty wonky issue as issues go in our space. So for the people in the audience who don't work in wireless, I think it might be valuable to have some more education. So I'm going to kick the microphone over now to Michael Calabrese, the director of the Wireless Future Project and a senior research fellow at the Open Technology Initiative at New America Foundation, who's going to talk a little bit about how spectrum really works.
Okay, thanks, Chris. And as Chris was saying, the increasingly wireless access to the internet is critical, and it's also even more so in terms of inclusion when you think about the sort of results we've been seeing from the the Pew Internet Studies Center, for example. Their surveys are showing that among youth, low-income groups, people of color, they're all relying disproportionately on mobile internet access, even compared to, to the population as a whole, which makes sense because there's many people now who are going to, just because of their budget, probably choose between a, maybe having some wired fast access at home and having mobile access. And plus, just most of the time, people are on the go, and so it's going to be critical that we, reclaim the airwaves in terms of what is a more open, fair wireless internet. So here's just some background. The spectrum is literally as you can see from kind of left to right, the spectrum of frequencies that are usable for communication. And it sort of goes from low frequency to high. This is logarithmic, so you can see it's expressed in terms of hertz, which are really tiny. Hertz, megahertz, more usually. So a television channel is 6 megahertz, and then up to gigahertz. So it's just the spectrum of frequencies, and those are some of the uses. Although spectrum is not real estate, we often say, nevertheless, location is critical. So frequencies are not equally valuable. It's the low frequencies that have great propagation characteristics. Where television camped out in the 1940s and 1950s before other things came along. Those are the beachfront frequencies, because in rural areas they go long distances. In other places they penetrate through trees and buildings. So you see here how important it is to have better airwaves, and hence the low frequencies are more valuable. And so you see here, just as an example, a slice of the airwaves below 1 gigahertz. And this is what a lot of the arguments are about in Washington right now concerning whether we're going to go through a second DTV transition. Because a portion of the broadcast television had, this slide is before, predates this last DTV transition, right, from 2 years ago. Television exclusively had 40% of the very best spectrum. Some of that has now been auctioned when they turned off analog, and the empty spaces, which we'll talk more about later, the vacant TV channels were opened for unlicensed use. The TV Whitespace, which was just finished in last fall. But television is still camped out on a huge part of this, and so there's a big debate about whether to pack TV down lower in the band and have a lot more auctions. Bandwidth is also important when you're wrangling in terms of the politics of spectrum, because the wider the channel, the faster the data throughput. So TV channels are around 6 megahertz. And that's great, but then Wi-Fi. One reason Wi-Fi is so much faster than your smartphone, your 3G smartphone connection, is because it has wider channels. They're overlapping channels of 20 megahertz, and so wider channels are better, which is good to remember. This is the.
There'll be a quiz on this later.
Yeah, this is the government's map of the airwaves, and. The conventional wisdom in Washington, of course, is that spectrum is scarce, It's considered scarce because, as you see, every bit of it has been assigned, or at least all the good stuff, has been assigned to somebody. So the commission, and Harold will talk more about this, they say like what some bands can generally be used for, and then they say who gets a license to it, or if it's unlicensed. But the reality is that spectrum licenses are what's scarce. In other words, you need the government's permission. The reality, actually, and this is a lot of the politics of the public interest activism around spectrum in Washington, is that spectrum capacity itself is abundant because the folks who have licenses for it are hardly using it. So in other words, even even here in Boston, in Manhattan, in downtown Washington, D.C., if you measure the actual use of the beachfront frequencies below 3 gigahertz, it's less than 20%, less than 10% in suburban and rural areas, and so that's why for example, TV, there's like an average of seven stations in a market, but they still have 49 channels assigned generally to them. So why can't we all just live together? You would think if there's plenty of this bandwidth, why is this all so expensive, and why is it so hard for LPFM, for example, to get more channels? Well, of course, a lot of it is the incumbents just want the profit off the scarcity. That's the main thing. But the excuses they throw up center around interference. And, some interference issues are of course, real. So this is an example of co-channel interference. In other words, if you have two radio stations, they can, they have a certain, from the transmitter, from the stick, they have a certain area they cover. And if that overlaps too much, you could get interference. So that's an example of co-channel interference. And the other you have is adjacent channel. So as I mentioned, the vacant TV channels are now in the process of being opened for public unlicensed use, super Wi-Fi. And, unfortunately, the broadcasters were so politically powerful that although, the Public Interest and High Tech Coalition that included all these folks here, although we were able to win in terms of prying access to those vacant channels away, the broadcasters succeeded in requiring that the power level be so low, much lower even than Wi-Fi. And the reason they said is, we have to protect, if you're operating next to a TV station, we have to protect viewers. We have to assume that you'll be standing next to a television set, essentially. And you can see there, one way they get away with kind of spreading out and polluting as much space as they can is with cheap devices, because of course every industry, particularly the incumbents who've been around, television, GPS, they would like to have their customers rely on the cheapest possible equipment, but that makes use of other spectrum much harder. Most white space, in other words, the unused spectrum that we should be going after for public access, most of it is actually reserved for government use. So the Air Force in particular has huge bands of great spectrum that if you measure, they seem to be hardly ever using at any given place or time. They say, well, we never know when we'll need it, or we can't tell you how we're using it. But there are increasingly ways to share that with smart radio technology, which enables shared access. Because spectrum is you got to remember, unlike oil, right, or coal, it's an infinitely renewable resource. Every millisecond it's not used is wasted. And bands can be shared on different dimensions. The technology is increasingly allowing this. It's not like the old broadcast days. So smart radios, cognitive radios, and databases, such as we'll use for the TV Whitespace, to give a list of channels that are available based on your GPS location. There's fewer and fewer excuses for not opening up spectrum for shared and unlicensed use. And there's a couple different ways you can do that. One is I would call an underlay. So we're already using, Wi-Fi has access to some military radar bands up into higher frequencies of 5 gigahertz because they use sensing. They listen for radar. If they don't hear it, They use the band. If the radar comes on, they switch channels. Another is what we did with the TV Whitespace, a sort of overlay where you fill in the empty spaces. And those empty places could be by geography, by time, etc. And then finally, just to remember that it is very possible, increasingly possible because of this smart radio technology, to have a public commons on the airwaves. Ultimately, we're going to need to move, and it will be better for everyone to move to a situation that's more similar to a public highway or to the shipping lanes in the ocean, where you simply have rules of the road and let the devices navigate around each other, but open all this unused spectrum for as much use and as many people as possible.
So thanks, Michael, for giving us a little bit of a look behind the curtain at spectrum and how it's divided up, what interference and all of these other things mean, and also for giving us a little bit of a heads up on smart radios and what we can do in the future to make spectrum a little bit more valuable. So that's where we are now. You saw that big chart, a lot of different blocks on it, kind of mysterious actually. On the sort of where should we go next, Harry will talk about that in a little bit, but before we get there, I think it might be helpful. You see that big chart, federal users, TV, cellular. It'll be helpful to figure out a little bit of how we got there. So next on our presentations list is Harold Feld, Legal Director of Public Knowledge, to talk a little bit about, well, how we got here.
Okay, let me start with a couple of caveats here. One is, this is approximately 85 years of spectrum history in 5 minutes on PowerPoint slides, which I hate doing. So, one, please pay attention to the pretty slides because I really hated doing this. And two, I know this is going to be a gross oversimplification, so everybody who is going to tell me during the question and answers period, well, what about this or that or whatever, I'm going to say, you are absolutely right, but this is what I could get in 5 minutes. So, once upon a time, there was only radio. And that worked out just great, and everybody loved doing it, and it was a very open platform, and you should all read Tim Wu's book, The Master Switch, to get a sense of how open it was at the beginning. But more people wanted to broadcast than the technology at that time could support. I'll skip over the debates whether that's really true or not, because this is sort of the orthodox version. But we will accept that at least the justification for how we got to where we are today was that more people wanted to broadcast than the technology could support. As Michael touched on, the question of what happens when you have all of these things going at once is that it causes interference. Now, interference is what happens when a device like this gets confused from multiple signals. The radio waves don't annihilate each other. You can have lots of these things going all at once if your receiver can handle all of that input and can screen out what it doesn't want and what it wants. But the problem is that particularly back in the 1920s and 30s when this technology was state of the art, receivers pick up everything, and it has the effect of lots of people shouting at each other really loudly, and it gets confused, and you get static, and you get, signal intercut with each other. And the idea is that if everybody tried to broadcast at really high power to these dumb receivers, nobody would be able to make effective use of it all. So the question was, how were we going to divide all this up? And Congress created this thing in 1927 called the Federal Radio Commission, which later became the Federal Communications Commission. And for many years, we used a system of comparative hearings, which became pejoratively known as beauty contests. And how this worked was really very simple. The FCC divided up the radio band, the set of frequencies that we were using for radio at the time, into something called the table of allotments. What they did was to say, let's put big, powerful broadcasting stations in certain places. We will draw circles around them to have an exclusive zone where only that can operate. We're going to offset this by a certain set of frequencies so that you can have multiple broadcasters in a geographic area, but they have to be operating only on a particular set of frequencies so they don't interfere with each other. And then we will publish this set of open slots, and we'll see who wants to get it. And usually you had multiple applications, and what the FCC said was, our mandate is to distribute this in the public interest. So what we are going to do is hold hearings to determine which of these applicants is going to best serve the public interest. And in addition, we're going to require something called public interest obligations, because we're giving this away for free. And it was very clear very fast that you could make a lot of money in the radio business. So this was an this little monopoly to operate in a geographic area on a particular set of frequencies was worth a lot of money, and we were giving it away for free. So the notion was, yeah, but you'll do good stuff for the public. That's the origin of what we call public interest obligations. And what would happen is you'd get these hearings, and people would come in with an application that would say anything. And I promise to do this or that, and I promise I'm going to do these public interest obligations, and then the FCC would choose between these two applicants or more applicants for the slot, and you'd end up with one of these guys having the exclusive right in their area. So as time went on, we found that there were a lot more things we could do than just radio. And because we were saying we're going to protect these guys from interference, whenever you added something new, you had to find a new space in the chart to make it happen. And as we did that, we were still resolving these with comparative hearings. You'd have to first come in if you had a new technology, like this mobile phone stuff, and say, okay, mobile phones, what are you going to do that's going to make it worthwhile for us to, give you your special slot? And people come in and talk about how wonderful mobile phones would be, and everybody who didn't want them to come in would talk about how awful it would be. And finally, they'd settle on some rules, and then they'd say, okay, well, who's going to have these mobile phone licenses? And sometimes they'd say stupid things like, well, let's give one free license to all of the telephone companies because they know how to do telephones, and obviously they wouldn't try to kill it to protect their existing business, because the FCC is a little naive that way sometimes. But we were basically, still resolving all of these with comparative hearings. And, we had different public interest obligations. When we brought in satellite, instead of having the traditional public interest obligations that we have on television and radio, our public interest obligation was we're going to set aside a piece of your spectrum for non-commercial programming. When we brought in phone service, we said the public interest obligation is we're going to make you, with your license, serve areas that are more expensive to serve as well as less expensive. Those are called build-out obligations, so that everybody will enjoy the excitement of mobile services. And, on and on it went. There were problems, however, with comparative hearings. One is applicants totally lie, and they break their promises. They will say anything to get their licenses, and then they get them, and then they're like, oh yeah, about all that stuff, we're not going to do that. The FCC totally doesn't care. This is really the big problem. I mean, as long as you're providing some measure of service in some way, the FCC doesn't want to do the one thing that it can do, which is pull a license. Because what happens is, the one place where Congress was smart in all of this was it said, we don't sell licenses in this country. Broadcasters do not own their licenses. They have no right to them except an administrative due process right, and whatever the right is that is listed on their license. So despite the fact that everybody talks about it's my spectrum, the broadcasters say it's our spectrum and we own it, and people who get it, say we own it, the Communications Act says no fewer than 5 times, no you don't. And I always tell these guys, I'm sorry you have such bad lawyers who can't read. I'm also sorry you didn't read your license, which is required by law to state explicitly, you don't own this, you only have the right here on the license, and that you didn't notice the part in the statute where you signed a waiver that says, I waive any claim against the regulatory authority of the United States. This does not stop people from doing it, but it does mean, however, that as a practical matter, the FCC doesn't tend to enforce these public interest obligations very much. Why? Because it's politically hard, because you can't really turn off service to people once they get it, because let's say you're, guys in a rural area and town center is being served, and company hasn't met its build-out obligations to serve, the less densely populated area. FCC says we're going to turn it off. The licensee says then these guys over here who are getting service are going to lose their service. You don't want to punish them, do you? So guys out here get screwed. It also was the case that comparative hearing cost a lot of money. They took a lot of time. There were a lot of opportunities for what they call green mail, people coming in and pretending to have an application so they can get people who wanted the spectrum. That might have been worth it, except for points 1 or 2. We, the public, were relying on the FCC as our great watchdog, to enforce these public interest obligations, and it totally didn't happen. So then, the FCC decided, okay, we will save money and we will just give this stuff away for free in lotteries. This was a phenomenally stupid idea. It was very easy to scam. The results made no sense because, you would just say, oh, what the hell? I'll spend, $5,000 to fill out an application to the FCC to get one of these new, commercial mobile radio service licenses. And then when I get it, that'll be so cool. I'll sell it off to somebody else. This did not last long, especially when the cash-strapped federal government saw how much money people who won the lottery, and it was literally winning the lottery, could sell these licenses for. So we moved on to auctions, which is pretty much how we distribute spectrum licenses today. My personal feeling about spectrum auctions is that spectrum auctions are the crack cocaine of spectrum policy. And the reason I say this is because the tragedy for the United States is that the first spectrum auction raised billions of dollars. And as soon as Congress got a hit on that, that was just it for sensible spectrum policy in this country. If you look at the initial statute that was written that sets out all these lofty goals for how we were going to use auctions and how they're supposed to promote competition and how they're supposed to, go to the, traditionally disenfranchised communities like minority communities and women and so on. And then we saw we could make a couple of $1 billion and we said, screw that, just get us the money. More charitably, you could say spectrum auctions are the worst way to distribute licenses except for every other way ever tried, because there are a couple of advantages to auctions. One is they're very easy to say who won. Unlike comparative hearings, which could stretch on for years, and then you had lawsuits, and with lotteries where you just sort of handed this out and waited to see who would actually build it, at least with an auction, you know who actually has the license by the time the auction is over. It does make money for the cash-strapped federal government, whether we think that's important or not, or even that it matters, because frankly, the biggest spectrum revenue auction ever, the 700 megahertz auction, raised $19 billion, and that is, less than a day's operating cost on most of this stuff. But again, the problem is you get a lot of people who think that, that's good. I mean, $19 billion is something. And the other problem or advantage, if you're so inclined, is auctions fit the dominant market ideology. This was conceived initially by folks who were all into the free market stuff. It fit in very nicely when it was adopted with the growing, market solve everything ideology. And therefore, as a method of distributing it, for better or worse, it's perceived as an advantage that, we can talk about it in market terms, and therefore, to the extent that we try to influence the auction process to make it try to serve some of those goals that are listed in the statute, you can fit it into the market ideology. Disadvantage are it locks in classes of incumbents, because those are the guys who win the auctions. It locks in business models, because if you have spent $1 billion on a primary resource for your asset, you are going to have to develop it in a particular way. You don't have, even if you start out with the bestest, wonderfulest idea in the world about what kind of wireless service you want to provide, when you start out owing $2 billion and have to build out a network, it kind of limits your options. It locks out traditionally disenfranchised communities. These things are scarce. They're kept scarce. They go for a lot of money. As folks are well aware, it is easier for some people to raise capital than it is for others. And despite the fact that the statute says we're supposed to design these in a way to help promote minority ownership and women ownership, the fact is we don't, and we haven't for a long time. And finally, it also locks out non-commercial or less profitable models for the obvious reasons. That's about it. With regard to federal spectrum, which Michael touched on, I'm just going to say the feds control approximately half the usable spectrum. I'm actually a little more charitably inclined than some of my colleagues are with regard to the federal government and how it uses it. I do think that there are a lot of important issues there. There's a lot of opportunity to be thinking about it creatively. And it's certainly true that people in the federal government are stubborn about rethinking how you might use spectrum more efficiently and in the public use. The first time I went to a meeting of the little working group in a little agency in the Commerce Department that is the coordinating thing for federal spectrum, and was talking to a guy about these technologies Michael was talking about that let you share. He started out by saying, well, you know, when I was in Vietnam, blah, 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 and it didn't work. And I was like, you do realize that technology has changed since 1971. But no, he hadn't. Or at least he hadn't emotionally accepted that yet. And that is the problem with a lot of the federal spectrum. You do have a core of people who are now coming to realize that we can do a lot more with this stuff, but we have a lot of issues in trying to get the federal government to actually work with the public on how to make this more effective for everyone. And meanwhile, the commercial interests want to see this in what I call slash and burn, clear and auction. Just move the feds out, auction this stuff off to the cell phone companies, and, you know, keep the hits coming. Everything else in here is too complicated, and I am out of time. So hopefully we will have the opportunity to talk about this more during the question and answer period. And I think our next speaker is actually going to talk about how we might move to a somewhat more sensible way of working and sharing the spectrum. So thank you.
Yeah, Harold kind of gave my segue for me, which was going to be that you can see there's a big contrast between how we got to where we are and where we could be. And I think that's a real opportunity, and I also think that's why we all work on this. We see the opportunities that the technology and the spectrum can make available, and that those opportunities aren't being taken full advantage of. Just a little bit about our panel before I kick it to Harry. Harold, Michael, Parul, and myself, we all work for public interest organizations on these and other issues, trying to, you know, as the title of this session goes, put the public back into public airwaves. But we're not alone in this. We have a lot of allies, including a lot of allies from the private sector. And Harry Wingo, as Senior Policy Counsel from Google, is one of those. And Harry is going to talk a little bit more about what we could be doing a little bit better and where Google comes down on all of this as soon as I find. There we go.
Thanks, Chris. Thank each of you for your interest and your time this morning. And I'm Harry Wingo from the DC office with Google. I'm a policy counsel there. And what I'm excited to talk about today is along the lines of how we can put the public back into public airwaves. And some great presentations so far. As people mentioned, there's a lot of technical issues here. There's a lot of history. It's kind of hard, as Harold said, to jam 85 years into a couple of PowerPoint slides. But just, you know, I hear them supposed to tell you what I'm going to tell you, then tell you some of it, and then remind you what I told you. But I think one of the most important things to get out there is on the incumbents point, actually. This was something that Harold said at the end. And I'd like for you to consider that the real true incumbent here is the people, or are the people, right? So how can we look at the people as incumbents? One way to do that is consider the interests that we have in the airways can be brought out through unlicensed use of the spectrum. So on that, we support spectrum policy that just as with Wi-Fi, which at one point was considered spectrum that wasn't really that useful, but once you put it out there for innovation, when people could do different things, experiment, you didn't have to ask permission, you kind of set the rules of the road, creativity, and people will actually get out there and do amazing things with it. And now we know that that has created a lot of value just from Wi-Fi, and that spectrum for Wi-Fi actually does not go as far. As has come up already, it's not beachfront property, so to speak, in terms of how it propagates, how it can penetrate walls, how far it will go. So if you think of TV white spaces, that's one of the main points I want to make here too, is that that is really important spectrum, and we hope that we'll continue down the path of having that available for innovation without permission. So for Google, what do we support? Just a couple points that we'd like to make. Efficient use of the airwaves. One thing to keep in point is market realities, and actually technological realities. This has already been pointed out. We have to consider how far technology has come and what that means for what we can do with sensing, which devices are there, dealing with the realities of interference, and just making sure things work. And also making sure that innovation cycle is not caught up with some of the administrative delays that can happen. I mean, it's tough work. The FCC is applying statutes and what Congress has said, what the American people have said through laws, and trying to figure out how to put the spectrum out there. But if we account for changes in technology and all the great things that have happened with Wi-Fi, we can see that Whitespaces has the same promise, and it's really important that we preserve this. But we also want to be driven by data when we make these important decisions. So we have to find out what's really going on. And so I'm just going to go through these. My slides will address how do we do a spectrum inventory, how do we promote and expand unlicensed use, how do we unlock some of the spectrum that's been talked about already, including federal spectrum, but also those all-important TV bands where it's just beachfront property and great spectrum for all kinds of uses, particularly broadband. How do we foster secondary markets? That's something also important to consider. And then encouraging creative spectrum management. So an inventory. Before we can do anything, we really should figure out what's going on and what's there and what we might do with it. Now, there's been a lot of work on this already, but we're also continuing to drive forward. So this knowledge can help industry policymakers and the public make fact-based decisions on this really important national resource. So a spectrum inventory, this is something the FCC has encouraged. We're actually going to be one of the database administrators. Anybody here followed that proceeding at all? I'm just kind of curious, and there's different levels of expertise, and some of this is wonky, but you never know who's in the audience. Anybody here been engaged in the, okay, I see a couple hands. All right. So as you know, we're actually one of the database administrators, as are several other folks. So we look forward to going through the next steps for that process. And that's going to allow us to actually, with the Whitespaces, determine whether devices that are out there can actually be used and be put to different purposes, and but also make sure that interference doesn't happen with the incumbents in the sense of the TV folks who are there. Secondary markets. This is the spectrum that's already out there. We should encourage people to make transactions on their own, to reuse spectrum. There are databases out there, but given technology and what we can do with information management, we should make sure that we continue to push forward on that as well, making sure it's complete, accurate, and current. If we know what spectrum's available, businesses can come up with new ideas for how to create value. And then another thing I know this is going to be dealt with probably in the questions, but the spectrum crunch. A lot of folks have pointed out that actually at any given time, there's a lot of spectrum that's not being used. And we had old assumptions about what you can do with technology. Harold did a great job of laying out the circles that were drawn, gosh, how many decades ago? Now there's a lot more that we can do. And Google, we have, I think, a perspective on this that's kin to where we are. We organize all the world's information. We try to make it universally accessible and useful. That's our mission, and so it has to be that we can apply technology and information management to this problem here. And again, it's really important to deal with facts and not assumptions. So unlicensed use, if we have lower barriers to entry, innovation's going to happen. We should set the rules of the road so that people can act in reliance on those and just go out there and do things, do what they do. Experimentation, collaboration, having multi-layer competition, this all is really important for the public good as well. And this benefits entrepreneurs and licensees. Who knows what's going to come up with a couple of entrepreneurs? For example, Larry and Sergey, they started Google as a science experiment, but because the web was open, and we believe in an open web, they were able to go out there and apply their idea. Next thing you know, we've got 25,000 people, and we're just 12 years old. We're not even teenagers as it comes to the age of the company. And so that's a really good example of what can occur when you're allowed to have innovation that can just move forward. The National Broadband Plan, it supports unlicensed use. TV Whitespaces particularly has been mentioned. This is bipartisan. There's been plenty of leaders on the Hill, clearly the Commission as well, said this is really important stuff. And as far as what's happening already, there's a couple of examples. Of TV Whitespace, there's cost-effective broadband deployment in Claudeville, Virginia. This was the first Whitespace deployment with Spectrum Bridge. This is a company that's pretty active in this area. They allowed high-speed internet access, the extended bandwidth and cost-effective broadband access in Virginia, in a business district and local schools. And they did it with fewer towers. That's the benefit of Whitespaces. As you saw the spectrum chart that Michael put up there, this is really high-quality spectrum, but because of the propagation characteristics, you can do a lot with just a few infrastructure deployments. It happens faster and it happens cheaper. As far as Whitespaces, other things that have happened already, and these are experimental uses, but demonstrates the value. We were also engaged with the same company, Spectrum Bridge, in Logan, Ohio. We did a healthcare deployment where some of the first responder vehicles or ambulances were able to connect back to a tower that had information. They were putting it out over the Whitespaces, and this demonstrates that for telemedicine, for information that can help save lives in some instances, that's another use that's possible. Another place where we did a deployment was in the Sierra Nevadas, and that deployment was also with Whitespaces, and could show some energy applications. That company was with the Pluma Sierra Rural Electric Cooperative. And Smart Grid, anybody here follow Smart Grid issues? Okay. I was at a Smart Grid company before I came to Google, and so that's a really exciting space. And again, if you can push the data out, sometimes broadband is a limitation, and all of these aspects too. One thing to remind folks, since you're here in the bigger picture, cloud computing, it's really just internet computing. It's just the internet. But what cloud means is when you can turn a lot more computer cycles for cheaper, storage is a lot cheaper, but you have to have the connectivity. Broadband is the lifeblood of the cloud. And so to apply everything that we can do to get broadband out there to more places means that more people will be able to leverage the power of cloud computing to do any number of things, to create value through businesses, to connect, to do press to the people, to also communicate politics, free expression. It's all there. The internet, but that's really, I just want to remind folks that that's what we're really talking about, that type of connectivity, and Whitespaces is a key component of that. Unlocking federal spectrum. So again, as far as incentive-based auctions, this could facilitate more use of broadband. The design is critical. This is still an open question. There's a lot of talk about how this is actually going to happen if it happens. One thing that at Google that we would like to encourage people to consider, stakeholders, policymakers, is if the bands, TV bands are repacked, to make sure that there's space for Whitespaces, for this unlicensed use of spectrum. And the bigger the band, the better, as has already been mentioned. That's really important. Also, if we consider how to use spectrum across those bands, you saw the big chart that was put up there by Michael. That's important to make sure that we don't have spectrum lying fallow or that's not used. And then preserving unlicensed use can be important for a number of things. Parul mentioned a really critical point, which is about how some underserved communities, people of color, are able to use broadband for any number of things. It's really important to have access, and we're convinced that having this access, having unlicensed spectrum, is a really important part of getting broadband out to more Americans. Secondary markets, again, it's really important. This is another way to make sure we maximize the use. Spectrum management, dynamic spectrum access, smart radios were mentioned already. There's a lot more we can do with technology. Sharing of spectrum. So again, we just really need to make sure that our policies are not preventing the best use of this public resource and that we're actually applying the technology that we have in the best way. But again, we have to find out all the facts, and this should be data-driven, all these decisions. And so again, back to Whitespaces. This is great spectrum. It's very important for having access to all the things that are going on in the internet, and for media, for business, free expression. It's a public resource, and so again, this is something that's in motion. We are innovating already. There's a lot of companies, from some of the examples that I gave, of just the experimental use of TV Whitespaces in expectation of where this is going. And so in that context, I'd like to remind people that the people are the true incumbents on this, because it's not just Google that's going to get in this space. There are so many other companies, and we don't know what type of innovation is going to happen, but we do know that we need to have that option out there. We want to make sure we gather all the facts, but continue to really push for unlicensed to be part of it. Thank you.
So from the early Whitespaces deployments and some of the possibilities of dynamic and shared spectrum access, we start to really get a window onto what we can do with technology to really help put the public back into the public airwaves. So the next question is, what can we do with policy? And this is going to set up our Q&A. What can policy and law do to help facilitate the amazing public benefits that technology can bring to us? I view wireless policy under sort of two tracks. This is a rough breakdown. These things interrelate all the time. You can't think about spectrum without thinking about competition, and increasingly you can't think about competition without thinking about spectrum. But just to help break it down a little bit, these are some of the major policy issues that all of us are working on right now within wireless. Under the sort of spectrum categories, the issue of incentive auctions. There's a lot of legislation on the Hill right now dealing with these, and also efforts to increase the efficiency of spectrum use, including through sharing and better technology. And on the second half, we have competition policy issues. So spectrum gets divided, gets used by some exclusive users and some unlicensed users. But once you get within that, there are a lot of policy choices that come up in terms of how do you manage that market? How do you get the most competition out of that market? And some of these issues are obvious. You have giant mergers that may or may not be looming, and policy questions arise as to whether to allow those to happen or not. And then some other things hide a little bit more behind the scenes here. So just a quick spectrum policy overview. Harry and others talked about the importance of measuring usage, and there are a lot of efforts going on right now within the policy community to try to measure usage and to try to put the right pieces in place to get better measurements. There's a lot of effort right now going into reallocating spectrum. As Harold talked about, how we got to where we are is sort of a complicated, convoluted process, and there may be some real opportunities to reallocate some of the spectrum and get more benefit out of it, but there's a lot going into that debate right now. And then the final part of spectrum policy is unlicensed, as Harry talked about quite a lot, and the tremendous importance of creating more unlicensed spectrum to really get a lot of innovation, a lot of social and economic benefit out of this spectrum. And there's a lot going on in policy right now to try to preserve the unlicensed spectrum that we have and to try to get more. Within the competition policy field, I sort of broke this down into three categories. Market concentration is a big deal. You don't have a lot of choices for your wireless provider. If you're in certain areas of the country, you may have 4 or 5, but I think a lot of people view themselves as choosing between AT&T, Verizon, Sprint, and T-Mobile, and in a year from now, that may be AT&T, Verizon, and Sprint. And these companies and others, there's a lot of disparity in how much spectrum they have, and that creates a lot of differences in the kinds of service that you get, and also in the market power that they can wield over the companies that make the phones, the companies that make the operating systems that run on those phones, the companies that make the apps that run on the operating systems that run on those phones. And all of this market power translates into a lot of really significant repercussions for how you use your phone that people don't always realize. And it's one of the reasons why we work a lot on competition. And then within competition, trying to enable some of these smaller companies to become better competitors to AT&T and Verizon tees up a lot of other active policy issues, including data roaming, device interoperability, and special access. Data roaming came up on the Federal Communications Commission's agenda yesterday. They actually adopted an order to adopt data roaming rules. So we made a medium scale victory yesterday, actually, on data roaming. And the final category of things involves consumer choice issues, trying to make sure that you can pick the phone and the service that you want and not be trapped by punitive early termination fees, not be rendered unable to pick the phone that you want because of exclusive agreements, and not be caught by surprise bills. So that's just a little bit of an overview. I want to kick this to questions now. And actually, Jim, would you mind turning off the projector since you're closest to that? Just to talk a little bit more about these policy issues and about what we all are working on, I want to open up the panel here to allow different people to come on. There's a mute button on the end of that, Michael, if you don't mind. And it shouldn't say mute anymore. You want to give that a shot? There it is. Perfect. So let's just talk a little bit more about what's going on in Washington right now and how spectrum and competition policy really matter and the impact that the debates that are going on inside the Beltway the impact that these debates really have on you and how you use your phone to participate in the mobile access to the internet. So let's start with, I think, the question that perhaps is most on people's minds, people who are following this space right now. What's going on with AT&T and T-Mobile? Anybody want to give a start with that? Michael, Harold raised his hand first, so.
To paraphrase Stephen Colbert, bad merger or worst merger? This is whether you're going at this from the sort of classic antitrust, which even Republicans profess to care about, that looks at traditional measures of market concentration, or whether you're looking at it from some of the more sophisticated policy perspectives that tries to take into account things like the impacts of network effects and how, as we've just been saying, it's not like anybody's going to break into the cell phone market anytime soon because you can't get licenses. The fact is that this merger is a total disaster, and there really are not a set of conditions that are going to make it look better. The good news is that unlike, say, the Comcast-NBCU merger, which was what we call a vertical merger, which traditional antitrust law just doesn't handle that well, this is a very straightforward, we're taking two big players and letting them merge creates one player that's about, close to twice as big as the next player and about 3 times as big as the third place guy. And that one is, as one Wall Street analyst says, the Department of Justice stops 2 out of 3 of those mergers. So it sucks, but there's actually hope on this one.
In addition to that, I would add that it's not just that, AT&T and Verizon Wireless would be 80% of the market, so sort of the horizontal. It's the fact that even if the government would not permit any merger in that market, again, there's just now other policies or lack of policy that has a lack of competition policy by the FCC that is pushing it toward duopoly anyway. So Harold mentioned spectrum in particular. You remember from those pictures I had up, some of them actually from our Citizen Guide to the Airwaves. That Jim Snyder here was his brainchild way back when, and we still have. But is that the fact is that there was original legacy grants of spectrum in the best beachfront below 1 gigahertz. In the 800 megahertz band to both Verizon and AT&T. So the cornerstone of their dominance is the fact that they have the very best spectrum that's worth 4 times as much as spectrum higher up. And then when we had the TV band auction in the 700 megahertz 2 years ago, they got 80% of that. So they have this sort of they've cornered the market on the best spectrum for this emerging wireless broadband. And then on top of that, what Chris outlined, all these provider costs. The fact that even though the FCC just required that they negotiate reasonable rates for roaming for, let's say, regional carriers, customers to get on their networks if they're in a place that, let's say, Cellular South is not. That doesn't matter because what they've done, for example, where they're going to roll out this 4G, right, is what they've done is it's not interoperable. The devices aren't interoperable. They've gotten a kind of a private band plan so that the other companies' devices can't work on their best spectrum. And then the cost of backhaul, because remember, these are also dominant telco providers. So the other carriers all need to lease lines from them for backhaul from the cell towers, and they charge exorbitant rates for that. And then there's the lack of choice by consumers. You can't just simply buy a device from Best Buy like you could a personal computer that will operate on any network so that you could sort of move from one to the other if you're unhappy. Instead, it'll only work often on their network or they lock you in, as Chris was saying, with these early termination fees which are poorly disclosed. I mean, the FCC will not even require adequate disclosure, not even the sort of disclosure you get when you buy a refrigerator.
So obviously we agree with a lot of what's been said, but by a show of hands, how many folks here have a smartphone and use their smartphone to access the internet? Almost the entire room. So based on what Harold and Michael just said, we are already moving towards a duopoly for broadband mobile internet access. That service is an unregulated service. So think about AT&T and Verizon deciding how much you pay, what applications you have access to, what devices you have access to. And those are the issues that I think are really important, especially, as I mentioned earlier, the importance of smartphones and the ability to access the internet through your smartphone. And
I'm gonna exert an input while the microphone gets passed down
Can I
to
just
Harold.
finish?
Oh, wait, sorry.
Okay, sorry. I didn't mean to interrupt you.
So I just want people to think about that we're moving to an area where Verizon and AT&T could be deciding prices, what phones you get to use, what applications you get to access. And I think that's a real concern for a lot of the folks in this room.
I really think there are sort of 6 groups of people affected by this. Consumers, whose prices may go up and whose choices may be constrained. Other wireless carriers who may get screwed over by changes to some of these costs, as Michael mentioned. Phone manufacturers who might start having fewer options in the negotiations that they enter into with the AT&Ts and Verizons of the world. Innovators and software developers who produce the apps for those phones. And the economy and the workforce in general, because I think a lot of people will be fired as a result of this merger. And the 6th group of people who will be affected by this are AT&T stakeholders and their lobbyists and their external lawyers who probably have a different perspective on this.
I said a real quick thing to say, which is obviously, like a lot of other companies, Google is taking a close look at the merger and to assess its possible impact. And of course, there's more information that will come out. For example, when their statement with the FCC comes out in a little bit. But I don't have anything beyond that to say here.
Just one quick point to build on what Parul was just saying. Parul was making the point that as a regulatory matter, the FCC doesn't exert any jurisdiction over the data side of what the cell phone companies offer. It's called an information service. What's important here is that both AT&T and Verizon have said they're going to move their voice service, which is the part that still is at least a little bit regulated to protect consumers, to LTE, which is the data side of things. So by about 2014, 2015, the cell phone will be entirely unregulated, which means that we would be looking at not just a potential duopoly, but one that is almost entirely unregulated.
I think I've got a couple of hands in the audience already, so that gives me a good excuse to go to audience questions. If our volunteer would help. I saw the gentleman in the back first. Yes, him.
The rules of the House is that I hold the mic.
Great. My name is Wally Bowen. I'm Executive Director of the Mountain Area Information Network in Asheville, North Carolina. We're a nonprofit ISP, and we were fortunate to be part of the Wireless Innovation Alliance that fought for the Whitespaces, and I wanted to thank Google and Public Knowledge and New America and all those folks.
We'd like to thank you as well.
Thanks. Well, we have people out in the rural mountains of North Carolina who are still on dial-up, who have made a lot of progress with the internet in the 1990s and have lost their businesses now because all the applications have advanced to broadband, and they've been left behind. They fought very hard with us to win the Whitespaces vote in November 2008. We predicted that in 18 months or so the Whitespaces devices would be out there and we'd be able to finally bring broadband service to them. But the Whitespaces issue seems to have fallen off the radar screen, and so I'm hoping Google and the Wireless Innovation Alliance can resurrect and really begin pushing to make this a reality, because I'm out there on a limb. People are asking me, you promised us Whitespaces, we fought for it, and it's not there. So where are we with that?
So Wally, thank you for your comment. Actually, meant to mention something that we're doing also, or that has happened in North Carolina. So thanks for reminding us about that. And as far as to what's happening, we're fighting with you. We want Whitespaces, as I hope I made clear in my comments. We think it's very, very important for the reasons that you said, and for so many others. We need to be able to innovate without permission.
Yeah, I think a lot of the delays that happened were procedural wranglings and pinning down the final rules. There was a long gap in between orders there before the Commission put out their most recent one, but that we're hoping will get the ball rolling.
Yeah, Wally had a good point that this was originally adopted in November 2008, and then there were petitions for reconsideration, right, from the broadcasters, wireless microphone guys, and others, which the Commission, partly because they were switching over to a new administration, took way too long to resolve, which they did last September. It was a kind of a final order, and now they're in the process of putting these geolocation databases in place, getting kind of the final rules on how that's going to actually be implemented. Google is one of the database providers. These databases, again, I think we mentioned earlier, will provide, based on where you're actually located, they'll give you the list of channels that are white, that are available for you to use. And that should be ready shortly. So there is chip work and standards work by the standards bodies, going on. And from what we hear, it sounds like things will be in the marketplace by, during 2012, and probably early in 2012 for the fixed wireless market, which is what Wally's interested in. That's the higher power, longer range rural stuff, and probably toward the end of 2012 for mobile devices.
Let me just say, there are a couple of things here. One is the advantage right now for Whitespaces is that everybody at the FCC wants it to work. The Republicans love it, the Democrats love it, the Obama administration loves it. Every time they're talking about their wireless policy, they throw in a sentence about the importance of unlicensed and Whitespaces, so that's all fine. The biggest danger, frankly, is if Congress screws it up by trying to micromanage the proposed incentive auctions, which is this idea of bribing broadcasters to get back spectrum. The fact is that because you got deficit hawks who are chasing every penny behind the couch. And folks who don't understand this stuff, and they hate the FCC. The idea is to try to, there are some folks who want to try to write these incentive auctions to take away the ability of the FCC to do this in an intelligent way. And if that happens, then there's a danger that this gets screwed up. But I expect that danger is fairly remote. If for no other reason than it's an uphill battle for Congress to actually do anything these days.
So I also want to join Harold in saying that if there are incentive auctions, that it's so important to make sure that Whitespaces aren't undermined, particularly all the progress that's happened on it. And Harold's absolutely right. There's been bipartisan support. This was mentioned in the National Broadband Plan, so that is definitely something that we are keeping an eye on and advocating to make sure that Whitespaces can keep moving along what we think is a good track so far.
Let's get another next question from the audience. Brian, I'll let you use your discretion. Everybody make good smiles.
We'll go. There's a section of the room.
This is directed primarily to the gentleman from Google, but anyone can feel free to chime in. As regards...
I'm sorry, could you say your name?
I'm Zach, sorry. Zach Stigler from Indiana University of Pennsylvania.
Hey, Zach.
We're talking about spectrum usage, and as far as the usage of that spectrum for wireless and the assignment of that spectrum, you mentioned the importance of lowering the barriers of entry and fostering innovation. But I was wondering how feasible or relevant that innovation is when we have the so-called fake net neutrality rules that, as far as wireless is concerned, doesn't really put any regulations on wireless providers that essentially allows them to discriminate and allows them to decide what apps and what sites and what services can come through the sort of choke points. And which, as if I recall correctly, and please correct if I'm wrong, that stipulation came out of the Google Verizon plan as well.
Well, let me start off actually, because I think I think that part of a lot of what we're talking about is really promoting innovation with unlicensed devices and services, which is actually the magic shortcut road around the AT&T and Verizon wireless broadband services, which are the ones that were subject to the weaker net neutrality rules for mobile broadband services. So I'm hoping that a lot of the innovation that happens sidesteps all of that.
So Zach, speaking of sidestep, I'm actually not going to address network neutrality here. And so what I will do is underscore how important having those options for unlicensed, along the lines of what Chris just said, what they are. We've made plenty of public statements on network neutrality of the issue, and I think I'm just going to stand by what we've put out there publicly. Don't want to make any news on network neutrality today. Thanks.
Let's move on.
You want to choose or shall I?
No, go ahead. I'll get you in, John.
Okay. Hi, my name is Kendra Muntz. I'm from Venice, Florida. I first time in NMRC. Appreciate everything you're doing. We need to get the word out to the people. I've just organized a 11-city, 11-day Florida media reform tour with Sue Wilson of Broadcast Blues, touring all over the state of Florida. We need to wake up the people, not just the media reform community. And I encourage you all to go to Broadcast Blues at 11 o'clock, by the way, because she hits right on the idea of getting after the FCC and showing what we, the people, can do about it. So what, from your point of view, what can we, the people, do about getting to the FCC so we're not just listening to all the bad stuff and hearing what you're trying to do in Washington?
Let me say a couple of things. One is, the first thing is facts on the ground. And particularly with the wireless technologies, the more people are out there and using them in these creative ways and telling us about it. We're really bad at telling our stories. And this is a problem when you go lobbying, because everybody, every lobbying group has nice, big, glossy things about how wonderful they are and how they serve their communities, and we're just terrible about collecting it. So the first thing I would say is it's important for people who are doing stuff to collect those stories, to share them with the Federal Communications Commission, with your member of Congress, because your member of Congress is part of this equation as well, with your state representatives, because we have states that are acting on things that are important in this area. I think the single most important thing that we can do is, tell people that there really is, stuff happening that's outside of what the big carriers are doing.
So, Kendra, thank you for what you're doing. And so my advice or my suggestion would be use all the tools that are at your disposal with the internet to make your point. I often tell people, get your blog on. Go digital, go viral. There's lots of tools that we have at Google. That's why I'm proud to work at a company where you can use YouTube. You can use it for free. You can have a YouTube campaign to reach people. You can also collaborate if you're trying to organize. It sounds like you're very well organized already, but consider using Docs or Google Sites or a lot of things for free. There's all other providers that do it. You can tweet. You can just go on the internet to reach people, because if you're not doing that, there's a lot of hearts, a lot of minds, and a lot of stories that you're not able to get and marshal and apply to this effort. And I think the FCC has made good strides in being more open. I know the administration is trying to have more tools, using cloud computing, for example, to have more connection to people. But I would say, definitely make sure you're using the internet in your efforts. And thank you for what you're doing.
I want to give a brief comment on that as well. My organization and others have given the FCC a lot of flack, and a lot of the things that they have done lately have not turned out as we would have liked. But they've also done a lot of really good things, and there are a lot of people there who really do want all of the right outcomes and really want to know what the public thinks those right outcomes are. So never stop sending in your comments to the FCC. Never stop signing on to our petitions when we try to get hundreds of thousands or millions of people's voices into the FCC, because they do listen. It may not always turn out the way we ask, but they listen, and there are a lot of good people over there.
And I just quickly want to underscore the point that Harold made, that when it comes to federal policymaking, it's not just the FCC. I think it's important to reach out to your congressional members. Unfortunately, telecom right now is not an issue where the people are crying out with what they want, and so the member has to make the right decision. If they're not hearing from folks, they're only hearing from the companies, and so it's unclear to them what the right decision is or what their constituents want. And unfortunately, telecom has not risen to the level of like healthcare or financial regulations where members hear from their constituents. And so I think the work that you're doing is great, and if we can organize to even make contact with congressional members, I think would be helpful as well.
Should we move on to the next question?
Jim Snyder from iSolon. My question is directed to Harold first and Harry secondly. Harold, you said that spectrum auctions were the crack cocaine of Congress and policy-making progress. And my question is, I'm looking for a specific percentage. Since the beginning of the auction era in 1995, what percentage would you say of the value of the spectrum rights that the government has given to the private sector or auction, what percentage of it was auction as opposed to given away? So from my perspective, auctions are not at all the crack cocaine of Congress. It's campaign contributions and other in-kind contributions. And that
there's lots of crack in the world.
Yes. So it does sound like, if you listen to Congress, that auctions are, but I would say if you actually looked at their behavior since 1995, you would find that it would be a very small percentage of the rights that Congress has, and the SEC and the NTIA have given away, received auction revenue. So I'm looking for what percentage of the total given away since 1995, the beginning of that era, resulted in auction receipts.
I have no idea. And I will add that it is a complicated question to set up. Because if we're going to do that, and we're going to have to figure out that analysis, then we're going to have to figure out what we mean by spectrum value, how that works out, what do we mean by giveaway, because God knows we could talk about, if we want to get really wonking in the weeds, we can talk about, the Nextel spectrum swap with the 800 megahertz rebanding and et cetera, et cetera. And, it's not something that I got on my fingertips, and frankly, it's not something that, from my perspective, at least as a policy question, is necessarily as interesting. And I'll tell you why. I'm not Grover Norquist. I'm not bugged by the notion of using public assets if we're going to make it an asset, or having spectrum that is used by all of us through unlicensed, if it contributes to the public good. And I think that is and should be the overriding importance. Incentive auctions being kind of the classic example of, are they a bribe to broadcasters? Sure. They're absolutely, totally a bribe. But I may get what I'm paying for this time, so it might be worth it. So, yeah, if I'm worried about recouping the value of the public asset, that's important. But it doesn't bug me nearly as much as seeing Congress chasing down auction revenue, when what they should be focusing on is how do we get communities of color involved? How do we make sure that valuable social uses are still being met? And how do we make sure that we get more unlicensed so everybody gets a chance to play?
Jim, thanks for your question. I think the only thing I would say is we should make sure that all our decisions in this area are data-driven. So this underscores the point that we just need to make sure we have all the facts, and all these issues are so important that we, just add that to the list of what has been the value that's come out of the system that we have already. And as we consider, particularly if we consider something that might threaten what we think is the trajectory that we're on to use more white spaces and unlicensed spectrum, that just underscores the need that we have to have the data to make the right decisions.
Should we? You want to jump?
Just a quick thing is that I know. I think the answer is something like 10 to 20%. Jim wrote a report for New America about the spectrum giveaways. Estimating, and it is it can be debatable about the value, but whereas we've raised something like $50 billion from auctions, the number on your report was something like $500 billion or more total value. But the main point, I think of it is that we're too often giving these spectrum rights away without getting a public interest payback, without having conditions that would, like as Harold said, the bribe may sometimes be worth the price, but let's make sure we're getting something for the public interest in return, and all too often we're not.
Harry had a brief follow-up.
Michael just made me think of something really important, which is if you put the spectrum out there, if you have unlicensed, and if you allow innovation to happen, we have to remember those values. We have to remember there's estimates that just, I think Wi-Fi, $100 billion, right? Just like what the industry's, that's been created with just that small portion in not the best spectrum that's out there, and that's very important to remember what that'll mean for GDP, for opportunity, for innovations, for jobs in all communities, around the country, and that's really an important thing to consider, and compare that against, the revenues that come in from auctions. And I think the bigger picture, or something to also consider, are all the economic good that'll come out of having, just more innovation and more opportunities.
Hi, everybody. My name is Ravi Kapoor. I'm with KAXT Channel 1 in San Francisco. And I had a question, namely about spectrum policy as it pertains to broadcasters, not because I think broadcasters are necessarily doing the best job with their spectrum nationally, but there are certain pockets of the country, San Francisco being one of them, Los Angeles being another, where people are actually using the spectrum allocated by the FCC in a pretty efficient manner. And I only bring this up because I happen to be a journalist who got into ownership, and the TV station that I now co-own is the most diverse TV station of its kind anywhere in the country. I have 12 different video signals on using that 6 megahertz band of spectrum that the FCC gave me, and I'm running a total of 20 channels. So I'm serving the Filipino community, the Vietnamese community, the Indian community, the Hispanic community. We have Taiwanese programming, Korean programming, English programming. This is one small, low-power TV station 10 miles south of Google that's doing something that has never been done before in the San Francisco area. And in Los Angeles, if you have rabbit ears, you get 110 channels for free, and Asians are able to watch 11 Chinese channels, and Vietnamese and Filipino and all kinds of stuff. So my question is, while I totally agree that the big broadcasters, as someone who's worked with the big broadcast companies, have seen the way companies like CBS just have their high-definition channel and nothing else, not providing any other services and not trying to do anything creative. The big broadcasters have let us down in that regard. But what do you do about all the independent and smaller players? Because in light of Comcast NBC, you basically only have a handful of players that have fiber, that have access to service as an ISP terrestrially. When you try to take another swath of over-the-air spectrum away from broadcasters, and now it will likely get purchased by Verizon, by AT&T, perhaps Google, and a couple of other players, there are more than 10,000 licensees for over-the-air spectrum. So are you going to kill all the low-power TV stations out there, the people who are doing ethnic or religious broadcasting? I mean, it's a real concern in the major markets where you have these real bandwidth constraints. How are you going to be able to rectify that situation? There's just technically, it's virtually unfeasible. I mean, my partner is a broadcast engineer, 40 years of experience. There's no way you can put on 89 channels in the Bay Area by taking 20 channels out of the band and auctioning it off. And so that's the question. You don't offer low-power must-carry rights. There's all kinds of stuff the FCC could be doing to help assuage this issue. But that's the point, is where's the balance? Because, again, you're talking about a handful of players that will be potentially purchasing the spectrum, and they'll be controlling all of our lives from here on out. So that's the balance. I mean, we need more independence in ownership? Don't we need more free media?
I think that question is really important, and certainly if you look around at the events happening at this conference, you'll find a tremendous number of community broadcasters, and the value and the benefits offered by this are certainly not lost on any of us here. I think we're all a little colored by the historical perspective of how we got here and by some of the technological possibilities. But you're absolutely right that balance is important, and I don't think any of us are our eyes are open, I hope, and we're glad to have you reminding us of the value of all of these, especially some of the community and the low power television efforts, which we know need a lot of help, and help from FCC policy reform and other areas. A brief answer too, and then maybe one final question since we're running low on time.
I would just say that what's sad is that your broadcasting efforts really are paying huge public interest dividends, but that perspective, what you're trying to continue, what you're doing is not even in the debate in Washington. It's sad to say right now, I mean, we don't. The White.
Well, I think that's a little. It's in. I mean, it's
No,
not.
there-
You're not
there's
talking about
nobody-
kicking them all off the air or anything. Like,
Well, no, because actually, low-powered TV will be knocked off when they pack down the primary broadcasters to the extent that they need your channel. Low-powered TV will have no rights and no compensation, as things stand right now.
hopefully, we'll fix that.
And yeah, that's right. But it needs to be part of the debate. I would really, love to have you beg you to kind of come and talk about this in Washington, and our community needs to talk about it. The White House just on Thursday morning had this high-profile Spectrum event at the White House to cheerlead around incentive auctions, and neither the administration nor the FCC has mentioned at all that they want to, as they do this repacking, that they want to look at the relative public interest benefits of different kinds of stations, or to preserve your kind of station. And that really needs to be important, and not kind of this mindless push to maximize the money from the auction.
I'll let Harry and then Harold both chip in quickly, and then one final question.
Robbie, thanks for your question. And I've been focused on Whitespaces and the value there. Not just some estimate, for example, could be $100 billion worth of economic value. That's some estimates for Whitespaces. And so incentive auctions, I hope I was clear that we still need more information. We still need the data, and I think it's important that you're raising some of the equities and pointing out that in addition to economic values, there's all types of things, free expression and value for communities. So I commend you for what you're doing. And although we're not opposed to incentive auctions at all in theory, we know that the details are going to be really important. So we'll find out where those go, but it's important to be engaged on it. Thank you.
Yeah, just real quick, one of the big problems in the policy debates is that, one, folks in Washington are very far removed from what's happening in the real world. And the other problem is that people tend to get very locked into their silos. So if you talk to some of the people who are just about the wireless policy, they'll tell you, well, broadcasting's obsolete and they're evil spectrum squatters, and who cares? If you talk to people who are worried about media and democracy and how, a smartphone that might let you surf the net is not a substitute for people talking to you in your own language about what's actually going on with current events in your community, then there's a lot of concern about this. So far, we haven't gotten to that level of detail, but it's critically important, as everybody else has been saying, that people talk to their members of Congress, that they talk to the FCC. There's an ongoing proceeding right now, which is looking to how the FCC could, under its existing authority, pave the way for incentive auctions, assuming Congress grants them. And very few people are raising the public interest concerns that you raise at this stage. And I would say that reply comments, I think, in that have not been filed, but even if they have, you can file with the FCC in most proceedings until they're closed. And I would urge you and others who are equally concerned and have similar stories to file about that in the FCC and ask, in the context of that proceeding, how are we going to be protected? And what happens to the social value that we bring?
I think we're out of time, and so I'm going to have to cut off and ask you all to take your follow-up questions through the free and open airwaves of a face-to-face conversation with our panelists when you can pin them down. Thank you all for coming.
Thank you all. Could I suggest that you take ongoing discussions? I'm sure each of the panelists would be willing to talk to those interested, perhaps out in the hallway within a few minutes.